Good day, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Governance and Policy Podcast by the Adam Smith Center, Singapore's first and only organization promoting pro-market values. The aim of this podcast is educational and to underpin the importance of economics, public policy ideas, and the humanities in general. I'm Colin, and I'll be the host for today's episode. Today, we're joined by Dr. Fredrik Tydal, who will speak on the intersectionality between literature and economics. Dr. Tydal is a professor at the English faculty at the Stockholm School of Economics in Sweden. He's also the current president of the John Dos Passos Society, which celebrates the literary works of Dos Passos, which are mostly set in the backdrop of America's post-war boom. Last year, Dr. Tydal taught an interdisciplinary module on literature and economics at Nanyang Technological University. How are you today, Doctor?
Oh, I'm doing very well. Thank you so much, and thanks to the Adam Smith Center for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about the intersection between literature and economics.
Right, it's very much our pleasure too. So perhaps we could start with what are the interdisciplinary links between literature and economics?
Well, I think, of course, literary scholars and literary artists, they've been interested in economic issues since time immemorial, I would say. And I can give you an example, perhaps, of why it is important for these two disciplines to have some dialogue and conversation. So let's take a work that many of you will be familiar with, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, many people would say, of course, that in this novel, even though it depicts the period that is often characterized as one of prosperity, one could say, of course, that Fitzgerald in many ways anticipates the Great Depression, because obviously, if we look at the story as a whole, things doesn't end up well for Gatsby. His dream is not realized, and of course, he perishes at the end. And so, in that in a sense, I mean, the novel as a whole has a foreboding quality to it. And so, even though it was written in 1925, it still has that sense of impending doom, right? These good times can't go on forever. Now, and if you ask literary scholars about this, I mean, how was Fitzgerald able to, in a sense, predict the Great Depression, the crash that would come? Then I suppose many would ascribe that to a certain inherent, prophetic quality of literature and of Fitzgerald in particular, perhaps, that literature has the ability to foretell things, to predict things. I mean, we can find many examples in fiction in general, where fiction has preceded reality, right? Something happened in fiction before it happened in real life. And we may think of, for example, the fact that we had African-American presidents in fiction before it happened in real life with Barack Obama. Of course, there's a different type of examples because that would be like a positive prediction, but still, fiction has a quality, right, of foreseeing things in a sense. So that's perhaps how literary scholars would explain how Fitzgerald was able to anticipate the Great Depression. But then if you ask economists about this, you might get a different answer. Especially if you ask economic historians, so how would Fitzgerald have been able to predict the Depression and what would ultimately happen? Well, then maybe economic historians could point to different things, such as the fact that there had in fact been this smaller but often overlooked depression earlier in the decade. And it's of course a depression that many economists are familiar with, but is perhaps not so generally known. So this was this small economic downturn. Well, it wasn't actually that small, but it took place right after World War I. And it was caused by the failure to reintegrate the returning servicemen into the domestic economy, right? And so it took a while for the labor market to reabsorb all these returning men from the war. And of course, in many cases, these were men who were wounded, either actually or mentally from the war. And so they couldn't get into the labor force right away. And this resulted in this recession where things looked pretty grim for a while. But then what happened was actually that the market corrected itself in the style of classical economics, right? Since I suppose, well, quite a few of the men, because of course there had mainly been men to the war, well, I suppose they healed, because time does heal wounds, of course, and so they were able to get the economy going again, and many people would have seen that slight depression. It's often called, there's been a book written about it, it's called like the forgotten depression. And so many people simply saw that as an aberration, right? As something that, oh, it was something that, well, one of those flaws and things that happen sometimes, but it corrected itself, right? But it could have been, of course, that Fitzgerald, well, obviously, I mean, everyone who lived through the 20s knew about this earlier crash, but many people would have perhaps overlooked it or discounted its influence, but maybe that was part of Fitzgerald's own analysis, that he saw what had happened after the war and saw perhaps that it could happen again, and that this facade of parties and glitter and glamour and all these things that characterize the Roaring Twenties, maybe that made people, less likely to imagine that something like this would happen again and on a larger scale. So if you ask economic historians about the Great Gatsby, then they might very well give you an answer that, well, Fitzgerald might have been thinking of this earlier crash and how it could potentially repeat itself on a larger scale. So that's like a very tangible example of the value of a dialogue, I think, between these two disciplines. Because then on the other hand, I think that also economists could also learn from fiction, right? And this the capacity of fiction to foretell and predict things, and also to in a sense, put a human face to economic developments and trends, right? So I think it also goes both ways, that both disciplines have something to learn from each other.
So since the Middle Ages, literature has portrayed the economic world in poetry, drama, stories, and novels. So why do you think the theme of money has captured the imagination of so many authors throughout history?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it has something to do with the fact that money is both familiar and strange, right? Because it's something that's part of our everyday lives. I mean, we use it on a daily basis. I mean, these days, not perhaps in its physical manifestation, right? With credit cards, etc., and online banking and payment services like that. So it's not as tangible to us anymore, but it's still something that's ingrained in our everyday lives that we completely take it for granted. So it's completely central to our everyday lives. But then on the other hand, there's also something that's still, I mean, even though money has been around for thousands of years, I think the first coins were produced maybe like the year 700 before Christ or something like that. So it's been thousands of years. But there's still something very strange, right, about money. And it's something that economic philosophers have pointed to. And I think you'll agree that even though it's something that's so totally everyday to us, it still has some, I hesitate to use the word like magic qualities, but there's also, there is something quite strange about money, how this little piece of paper, and these days, of course, where we have like numbers and on a screen, and how that has value in and of itself, even though it only has the value that that's assigned to it. And it's, yeah, again, it's something that's interested philosophers throughout history, and obviously also writers. I mean, David Hume, actually in some of his writings that predate his friendship with Adam Smith, he talks about this. He has his short essay on money, where he precisely talks about this issue, how money only has the value that we assign to it. Because there was, of course, this shift way back in history, because where you have the difference between commodity money and representative money. So commodity money would be things like, tokens and things that have an actual value, like gold or silver, where the value of the coin would be equal to the value of the material of the gold or silver, right? And even before that, you would have like shell money, where there was still some value to the actual object. But these days, of course, and even less so with paper money, there's no like commodity value to it. There's no value beyond the nominal value that's printed on the bill, and even less so, of course, with the figures that we see on the screen. So I think that's also why writers have been interested in money throughout history, because again, it's something that's both familiar and strange, and all those 1,000 years haven't really taken away that layer of strangeness to it. I don't think, at least. I mean, it's not something that I think about every day, like using money. Like, whoa, this is really weird the way that we do this. But still, when you think about it, it's it's. I mean, not like strange in a weird way necessarily. It's just it makes you think, right? So it's not surprising, I think, that writers have been interested in the theme of money.
Right, so you've rightly pointed out that money is a rather peculiar commodity that has really captured the imaginations of authors. So I'm just wondering, like, how does literature animate certain economic theories and ideas, and do certain forms perhaps lend a specific quality of money better? Does drama portray it better than, say, a novel?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question as well, and I think it's interesting if we look at the emergence of modern economic theory. Of course, we have the Adam Smith Center today, and already Adam Smith, I mean, he is quite literary in the way that he presents his theories. And I suppose, I mean, I'm not an expert on Adam Smith, but of course, it would be rooted in his own background as a moral philosopher, of course, having published the Theory of Moral Sentiments before The Wealth of the Nation. So he was already kind of steeped in that humanistic type of thinking. And if you look at The Wealth of the Nations, I mean, unfortunately, I didn't have time to reread it for today's session, but it's a vast poem, of course. But when we think of Adam Smith and when we think about The Wealth of Nations, we think about those ideas that he was able to capture so eloquently and in this literary way, almost, I would say. Because again, when we think of Adam Smith, we think of the invisible hand, which is, of course, I mean, it's a brilliant metaphor, and again, a very literary one that you can really so vividly recall, right? Having once had it described to you, it's very difficult to not remember it, and it has to do with his power of representation, I think. And I mean, the invisible hand, I mean, that's a narrative in itself, right? It's story in a way, a mini story, and you can see why it's been so effective, of course, as a result of its narrative properties. But even his language itself is, I mean, even though it's not an easy read, The Wealth of Nations, but there are those moments that stand out because of the way that he deploys literary techniques, right? Of course, one of the most famous lines in all of it is his description of the centrality of self-interest. I mean, the very way that he uses alliteration in that passage, it's why it's so easy to remember. I mean, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their from their self-interest, right? And again, that alliteration, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, baker. That's obviously quite intentional, and it's one of the reasons why that line sticks so firmly in all of our consciousnesses. And of course, even on the very first page of The Wealth of Nations, I mean, he starts right off with that example from the pin factory. And again, it's just such a very vivid and visual way of thinking and presenting economic theories in a very concise way. And I think what's also interesting about that whole period is that, well, Adam Smith comes a little bit earlier, of course, in the late 18th century, of course. But what's interesting in Britain, of course, you have the explosion of the novel and sort of the emergence of the novel as a dominant literary genre during the Industrial Revolution. and especially, of course, peaking in the mid 19th century. So there's a sense in which the emergence of modern economics, in Britain at least, it's somehow bound up with the rise of the novel, because then later on, of course, all the great 19th century novelists, like Dickens and so on, they were all dealing with these issues, the impact of the Industrial Revolution in their writings. So that's also where you start to find, well, the interest in the world, in the economic world, growing much stronger, at least in Great Britain during that period. Of course, we would see other tendencies around the world as well, but yeah, focusing just on that British context.
Right. So so we know that so speaking of the literary word, the self-help genre has been a way for some new authors to kind of weave fiction into an otherwise factual guide for success. So do you have any comments on that, like using the self-help genre as to kind of bring across fiction?
Yeah, the self-help genre is quite interesting because it's been used, at least, yeah, there's two recent examples of novelists who've used the self-help genre in a satiric way, appropriating the genre in a way for their own purposes. And one of those is How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia by Mohsin Hamid. And Mohsin Hamid, I believe he was born in Pakistan. And the interesting thing is that the other novel, recent novel that I sort of attached to that trend is The White Tiger by Aravind Adiga, who's an Indian author, Indo-Australian author actually. And that novel was given the Booker Prize earlier. And they both sort of rely on the self-help genre. Hamid's novel does it in a very, well, not programmatic way, but a very schematic way, right? Where his chapter titles are modeled after various types of advice. And the self-help genre, it goes quite far back into history. Actually, it's an older form of genre than most people know. So the first self-help book was by a man called Samuel Smiles, and he published a book that was actually called Self-Help in 1859, I believe. Again, tying back to that whole period, sort of the tail end of the Industrial Revolution in England, and we find ourselves returning back to that context, maybe because it was really formative in the relationship between literature and economics. And the interesting part about that book, which was the first self-help book, well, there had been other examples of that before, like Benjamin Franklin's The Way to Wealth. Although, of course, it didn't use that term, but what set Samuel Smiles' book apart was the fact that it actually created that genre and used that title as well. So the book was called Self-Help, and the interesting part about it is that the name of the genre itself comes from Shakespeare, because on the title page of that book, Samuel Smiles quotes from Polonius' speech in Hamlet, saying that this above all, to thine own self be true. So it's interesting that a genre that's a little bit like lowbrow in some ways, looked down on, actually takes its name from Shakespeare. But yeah, the self-help genre, it's interesting that it has such a long history, and of course it's connected to the idea of rags to riches to a certain extent, the American dream, the Protestant work ethic, but it's still a genre that seems to have internationalized, to globalize, since we now see it being used as a frame by these two authors of South Asian origin. So that would suggest in some way that the self-help genre has gone global in the same way that free markets have gone global, because that's the connection that I would see, because if we think about the self-help genre as originating during the tail end of the Industrial Revolution, when of course there were a lot of opportunity, not for everyone, but certainly for some people, and there was this sense of being able to find some kind of self-realization, self-actualization. And then again, now we see the genre being again used when we see these booming emerging markets, well, mainly in India, of course, but also Pakistan, other places, well, obviously China, although I don't know any examples of that trend from China. But then on the other hand, probably the most famous self-help book of all time is Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, which has at least been very influential in the US. But what's interesting about that, because I for many years assumed that it came out in the 50s, sort of representing that post-war optimism that we see in America in that time. But it was actually published in 1936, in the middle of the Depression. So I don't know exactly how you can fit that into the whole narrative. Maybe it's simply the fact that the self-help genre, it touches something very essential in people. And I suppose even in the middle of the Depression, people wanted to think positively about the future, try to tailor their CVs in the best way they could, and to mobilize their various friends and connections and so on in order to try to get back on their feet again. But yeah, it's definitely interesting that in recent years we've seen the interest in the self-help genre coming from these emerging markets in Asia. But then on the other hand, of course, those novels, they use the form ironically, as I said. So it's not exactly the same thing. So maybe it's more of a critique actually against the self-help genre. So yeah, I guess we'll have to see where the self-help genre goes next. But it's an interesting intersection between literature and economics, I think, personal economics, of course, in this context.
Right. So you've also just now pointed out that the rags to riches story has been a long-standing literary staple. So I'm just wondering, like, how does our modern sensibilities and shifting definitions of success, how do you portray it in literature today?
Yeah, it's interesting because the rags to riches story, even though we associate it with the United States in many ways, I mean it's a notion that's been around since forever, and I would say, and in the Western cultural consciousness, it's most intimately connected to Dickens, right, and especially Great Expectations. Even though he didn't coin the term rags to riches, which was rather, well, not really coined, but it was associated with Horatio Alger, this American writer of the late 19th century, who wrote these idealistic stories about a young person coming across this great opportunity and making his way, well, not actually to the top of society, because in most of his stories, they had protagonists of working class background who managed to make their way to the middle class, rather. But yeah, so it's a central like trope or figure, which we also of course see in real life. I mean, it goes really far back. I mean, where people of humble origins managed to transcend their beginnings, their origins rather, and really make it to the top of society. I mean, we can find examples of that. Kings and queens of previous times. I mean, the Hongwu Emperor of China, the founder of the Ming Dynasty, that was pretty much a rags to riches story. So we can find plenty examples of that. And then, of course, that has been codified in different ways in different cultures. In the West, of course, mainly with the rags to riches story, and then specifically in the US with the American dream, which is It's similar in a sense. I mean, it's a version of the rags to riches narrative, but suggesting that there's something special about America, that there's something inherent to America that makes it easier to go from rags to riches. But then part of that also is, of course, the Protestant work ethic. So you also have that within Christianity, the idea that you work very diligently. And then you're able to to make your way in society, and again that's found obviously in Benjamin Franklin's the Way to Wealth, and so it's a concept that has a very long history, and for some reason it's been very strong in the West, but then we also see it I think especially in Asia again. Thinking of all these emerging markets, I mean, there's been a number of recent authors who've been interested in these issues. There's one Malaysian author called Tash Aw. I don't know if you're familiar with him. I know that he was actually like a writer in residence or something like that at Nanyang Technological University. And so he's a Malaysian writer who writes in English. And he has this novel called 5-Star Billionaire, which is about these. Well, it's almost like a collective novel, collective style novel. It's similar to Dos Passos in a way. It's like an updated version of Dos Passos' Manhattan Transfer taking place in Shanghai. Or well, I shouldn't even compare him to Dos Passos because it's a very original piece of work. But of course, where Dos Passos saw New York City as the hub of economic progress in that period, Tash Aw sees China as now being the center. And of course, it's very interesting to think about the I don't know, the current relationship between the U.S. and China, and how they're both sort of competing for the the top spot in the global economy. And Tash Aw definitely shows that China is a strong contender here, of course, not without problems or so on. It's not like a clear-cut issue, but it's a very interesting way how he's able to make that development more concrete. I mean, what's happening in China now with the economy and the absolutely striking growth that they're experiencing. And so he's definitely being able to make that development more concrete and to put a human face to those economic trends, right?
So how would an interdisciplinary approach enrich a student's understanding of either disciplines?
Yeah, I think that, I think the important thing is to have a dialogue. I mean, as disciplines, they are still pretty far apart, like one in the humanities, the other in the social sciences. So I'm not sure it is possible to bridge it entirely, or if it's even like a goal worth pursuing to actually like bring them together. I mean, I think it's better to have some kind of dialogue and to try to see what each discipline can learn from the other. And maybe it's up to the students to perhaps make those connections and bring them closer, right? I mean, it's all about what the students can benefit from bringing them together, how that can advance students' understanding of the global economy and of the challenges that we're facing, and how looking at how past literary works have looked at economic developments or economic crises, and so on. I think that's a very could potentially be a good method of predicting things to come, etc. Again, thinking about how Fitzgerald was able to predict what happened at the tail end of the 1920s. So I think we can give the students the tools to better see the relations and the connections, but then they have to make those connections themselves and then act on them in some way, I suppose. But again, they are quite far apart as disciplines go. But I think that if you manage to outline the connections, you can find some very fruitful results potentially.
Right. So having taught the interdisciplinary module between literature and economics, is there a particular framework or a type of assessment that you might recommend educators look into?
Yeah. So when I taught this course at NTU, there were certain institutional frameworks that I had to keep myself within. So I couldn't just take the course that I've been teaching at home and simply apply it, or simply do it directly, but I had to adapt it to the Singaporean requirements. And one of the requirements that I hadn't had before at my home university, but that they required at NTU was this creative project that I had the students do. And I tried to think about that, like, okay, so I have to include some kind of creative project for the students who've read all these novels having to do with themes of money, economics, greed, and things like that, such as Gatsby, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, etc., etc. And I came up with this creative project called My Way to Wealth, inspired by Benjamin Franklin's essay, The Way to Wealth, again, where the students had to relate their readings to their own lives, basically, to let their readings somehow influence their daily lives, or try to approach the novels using their own lives as a framework. And I also had this kind of sub-project within the creative project where the students were asked to take a piece of advice or some idea from one of the projects, from one of the books that they read, and then to apply it in their everyday lives. And I saw some really interesting examples here of students like finding some cool pieces of advice in Franklin, for example, about like frugality or saving money, industry, things like that, being more industrious, but also some things from the Great Gatsby, such as not valuing money over relationships or things like that, etc. So there were some really interesting results, I think. And then as part of this project, they also had to, the students had to crowdsource their fellow friends and relatives on social media. So I asked them to post like a question on their social media of choice, like, what is your number one advice for success? And then the students had to use that advice also in their projects. And it was kind of interesting because in many cases, where the students just dropped that question and they were not allowed to explain to their social media contacts why they were asking that question. And then there would be some interesting dialogues on their social media, like, oh, what do you mean, like, success? How do you define success? Like, financially, personally, in what ways, in religious terms? And then, yeah, students also got an interesting discussion out of that as well. Like, how do we define success? What do we mean by it? I mean, historically, it's been defined financially, and that's also to a certain extent how Benjamin Franklin defines it. But yeah, we saw some interesting things emerging out of those assignments. I think certainly very interesting for me to read them. So that would be one way, I suppose. Again, to help students encourage make those connections between those disciplines. Because again, the economy is so central to our everyday lives. So if you can somehow integrate that into the students' own lives, then they're better able to reflect on those issues, I think. So yeah.
So Dr. Tydal, it's been a pleasure discussing with you the intersectionality between literature and economics. Thank you for your time and insights.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you so much.
This has been the Governance and Public Policy podcast by the Adam Smith Center, Singapore.